Hello, everyone, and welcome to Art Talks Presents, a program brought to you by EPCC's Architecture Society. Today, we will be interviewing James Benedict Brown, Associate Professor at Umeå University in Umeå, Sweden. I will be your host, Emmanuel Moreno, Associate Professor at EPCC and Faculty Advisor for the Society. We hope you enjoy the program. I'm going to say good morning, James. How are you doing?
And I'm going to say good afternoon, Emmanuel. I'm good, thank you.
Good. So I did that on purpose so that our audience can see that, I'm in El Paso, Texas, and you're in Umeå, Sweden. Is that correct?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Great.
And I'm a long way. I'm not only a long way east. I'm also a long way north. We live around about 64 degrees north, and that's the line that goes through Alaska, basically. I mean, we're level with Dawson City in the Yukon. We're a long way north, and that has a huge effect on the climate and the sunshine that we get up here.
It's very interesting in the situation that you're in. You and I met in Salt Lake City, Utah, at a beginning design for beginning students conference. Could you tell me about your experience, what you felt, what you thought, what you learned?
Yeah, that was a great conference, and it was a conference that I got to go to for, I think, 3 consecutive years. I went to one event in Texas, one event in California, and one in Utah. And basically, this is a conference that moves around the United States every spring. And it is a meeting of people who teach design and architecture to freshman students, or to first or second year students, as we call them. And those people come and they present papers where they talk about the work they've done and the projects they've done. And it's a lovely 2.5-3 day event where you see so much innovation and so much great work from around the country. And there are increasingly people who come from Europe to it. I was really lucky to get a bit of money each year from my university to kind of develop my career, because they recognize that teachers need to be exposed to other people's work to learn. And I really enjoyed those 2 or 3 days, probably like you, Emmanuel, just going to sessions and listening, sometimes drifting off and just wondering whether you could do that project in your school. Yeah. And it's just a really great treat. And it's quite difficult to get money out of the university when you want to go to a conference. So it's nice to go to a city like Salt Lake City, which I would never have visited otherwise. So it was a real privilege in that regard. Yeah. Like that.
Fantastic. And so you coming from at that time, if I remember correctly, you were teaching in the UK. You came to the US. What did you notice, if any, there were any differences between the education in the US versus the education in the UK, or shall we say in Europe?
I think what I appreciated the most is that in the US, it is extremely common, if not normal, for students to spend their freshman year mixing subjects that they want to study and just picking and choosing. And obviously that may or may not be the case with your students, but that's really valuable to have a year of mixing the humanities and getting a general feel of the different subjects. In the UK, you would choose the subjects that would lead to university exams and entrance at the age of 16. So there's a lot of pressure on teenagers to really know what they want to do, even if they take a gap year, which is also common between college and university. We put our students under a lot of pressure to decide their path. And I've seen so many students who realize in their freshman year they're on the wrong path and they need to change direction. And I think it's a really great thing that you get that chance to try it out, because your first year at college or university can be disorienting. It can bring up unexpected challenges, and it can just be hard work. So that's a big advantage. But it also made me aware about how American students relate to the cost of their education. And my wife is American, and she studied at Boston University, and she worked throughout her studies, and that was hard. And I appreciate that, you know, many of the students who are listening to this may well have a job. They go to evenings and weekends. They may have caregiving responsibilities as well. And that is a burden. And in places like Sweden, where I am now, where there is no cost to going to university, or it's like $100, $200 a year, just to pay the administration, I wonder sometimes whether our students would benefit from learning to manage the pressure of juggling those responsibilities. Because, you know, I can't say anything to your students now to reassure them or to make it easier, but I can say those are amazing life skills that you are developing, and you can probably do something in an hour that some of my students would spend a week thinking about because of all this, you know, the space and time they have.
You mentioned that school is free. Are there certain requirements that the students need to meet in order to be able to get free, or is it just free for everybody?
It's free for everyone in the European Union, which, as a side note, is one of the reasons, you know, that Brexit and the decision of the United Kingdom to leave the European Union is so tragic, because up until now, British students could go anywhere in Europe and study under the terms of that country. So a student from anywhere within the European Union effectively pays nothing. They pay a few thousand crowns, which is a few $100s. And Swedish students also get a maintenance allowance from the government, which is to support their living costs.
Wow.
Some of our students work, but in the main part, this is not necessary. But the flip side is, you know, Sweden is a high tax economy, and we tend to see that the majority of our students are from wealthy backgrounds. We don't have the same socioeconomic diversity that you do in the typical American university, because the requirements to get into university are, you asked about requirements, there are exam requirements, you have to achieve a certain let's say grade in your secondary education, but we still have work to do to diversify that a little bit, and I think there'll be some positive steps in the future to do that.
I see. So you've taught in several places. Can you tell me a little bit about, you know, where you've taught and what you've taught, and then if there's any differences between those, or are they very similar? What are your thoughts behind that?
Well, the United Kingdom is a post-colonial superpower. We used to be be at the center of this international empire, but some of the things that remain are still quite colonial, and the British model of teaching architecture is used by many countries as a kind of standard. So in principle, the course I teach on now, the program, is very, very similar to a British architecture school, because a lot of universities internationally turn to the British model, the Royal Institute of British Architects, to endorse and validate their teaching and their program. And that becomes like a seal of approval that you can get every 5 years that says the course is of an international standard. So I studied architecture in the United Kingdom. I went about 3 hours away from where I lived to a university in Sheffield in the north of England. And I studied for a bachelor's degree in architecture and then a master's degree. Those two parts in the UK are called Part 1 and 2. And I had every intention when I finished that I would, you know, become an architect. But I graduated in 2008 at the beginning of the Great Recession, as it was called.
Right.
And it just made it impossible. I was going door to door, literally going door to door, actually leaving resumes in places. And I was actually meeting, in one case, I met an employee as he was leaving with his box. He'd been dismissed that day.
Wow.
And he was leaving. And it was a pretty depressing time to be a graduate and to think, what have I done? I've trained for a career in an industry which is the first to get hit in an economic downturn.
Right.
And so I was unemployed for maybe 9 months, and my wife supported me, and I did some small jobs here and there. But what that period led to was the offer of doing a PhD, which is, a 3-year research degree, and that came with a scholarship. And that basically, I treated it like my job. And so that PhD was the thing that got me into teaching, because I'd left university with a kind of an itch I wanted to scratch about the way I had been taught, which would be another interview altogether, another conversation. But basically, I had questions about the validity of some of the things we did, and I wanted to explore that. And I had the opportunity to study at Queen's University in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and I wrote a PhD, a 120,000 word thesis about this, and that was the kind of the ticket that got me into teaching, because being a doctor of philosophy kind of opened up doors to jobs that I wouldn't have been able to get otherwise. And so I started teaching in a small arts university in the east of England called Norwich University of the Arts. And actually at the conference in Salt Lake, this happened a couple of times. I think in Connecticut or somewhere in the Northeast, there's a university called Norwich, which is the same spelling, just a different pronunciation. And I actually exchanged business cards with the lady from that university who'd come to give a paper. Occasionally, we literally got each other's mail. Our university in England got things that were supposed to have gone to the USA. So I worked for 2 years on a new program, a new architecture program, and I was there on day one when the students arrived, and I helped start it, which was really hard because there was no, it was a blank space. There was no culture. The students didn't know anything about the subject really. We didn't really have an ethos or a culture. And then I moved to a larger university where I worked for 3.5, 4 years and had some good career progression in Leicester. And then I kind of had a career wobble, like when you think you wonder what you're doing. So I took some time out and I did something completely different for a year just to get my brain back in order. And it was sort of in that time period that the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, and that was a big disaster in my political opinion. So I started to look for jobs in Europe, and actually even further afield, actually in Australia, which was kind of counterintuitive. But in 2018, I had 2 interviews within a couple of weeks of each other. And one was here in Sweden and one was in Melbourne, Australia. And my wife and I just had this big decision to make about where we would go. And we chose northern Sweden. And here I am sitting in a old farmhouse that I'm now renovating in the Swedish countryside.
Oh, how fun! How fun! You mentioned the Royal Institute, which reminded me you have these podcasts, the ArcEd podcasts, which I've listened to. I don't know if I've listened to all of them, but I know I've listened to several of them. One of those, when you mentioned the Royal Institute, I remember you had a podcast of a lot of angry students with the Royal Institute about the education. Did anything come about that? Can you explain a little bit or tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the one thing that is really constant in the UK amongst architects and students is that we all really think that the RIBA, as we call it, Royal Institute of British Architects, could be different or could be better. And the fundamental problem is it really should be a trade union, because there's no trade union for architects in the UK. We have no negotiation body. We have no one who represents our interests as workers. RIBA is it's an old boys club. It's in a really wealthy part of London, and it's sort of next door to these other really old institutions. It's next to the BBC, and you walk in there and you feel like you should be wearing a bow tie and a tuxedo. And it has a slightly conflicted mission, which is to promote architecture, but also to represent the interests of architects. And those two things are different. They pull it in different directions. and it's quite expensive to be a member. And if you don't live in London, it's very questionable how much value you get out of it. And in fact, in Scotland and Northern Ireland, which are the furthest parts of the United Kingdom from London, there are actually their own representative bodies there. And I'm not a member anymore because I don't practice architecture. There isn't really much point me paying the fee. And also, once you stop being a student, you stop getting the discounted membership or the free membership. And it sort of has reminded a lot of people in recent years that we could really do with a trade union. You know, we could really do with a powerful voice that represents our interests, because, you know, architects don't always get a fair deal when they're working, and they don't get paid fairly. And it's very difficult for minorities to succeed and to progress in the industry. And we lose women as well. It is not an industry that supports women very well, especially if they choose to take a career break for childbirth. So yeah, I think there's always that kind of frustration with it, and I don't know whether it will ever be resolved. But it's good that students can be angry about things, because when students get angry, things start to happen. The world is not changed by older people like you and me, I'm afraid.
Thanks.
We're on the way out, I'm afraid.
Yeah, don't remind me. You know, talking about your podcast as well, you said you took a little break. Was that when you went to Africa, or was that part of the university?
It kind of is, but they're sort of not. One didn't lead to the other. Between 2016 and 2018, I think. No, sorry, 2014 and 2018. I worked in a big university that had expanded very large. It was expanding rapidly. And just to be clear, in the UK, higher education is not free. You pay tuition fees. And that is a relatively new thing in my lifetime. It used to be free, and now it's paid. And that transition has been difficult. And that university I was working in had borrowed a lot of money to grow. It had a huge amount of debt, and it was building new buildings, and it had all these initiatives, and it had great sort of student-focused initiatives and programs, things that helped students. And it was really, you know, it was a dynamic place, and it had great reputation, but it was also working its employees very hard. And I was choosing to commute a distance of about 3 hours, and I would stay away from home a few days every week, and basically the stress just got too much, and it was damaging to my personal health and my physical health. And I did it for 3 or 4 years, and I had some really good progression as a teacher. But I made the decision that I'd gone as far as I could, and I needed a break. So I took a year off, and I did just a little bit of teaching. I went to London one day a week, and I supervised dissertation students, so history and theory students, in their master's degree at the Royal College of Art, which was just so easy. Just one day a week, I'd go in, sit down, meet all my students, talk to them about what they were writing, and then I'd get the train home. And actually, I didn't really interact with anyone else. There was no office politics. There was no pressure from my line manager. I just went and taught, and it was beautiful.
Wow.
I did that, and then the other 3 days a week, I worked for a company that was using electrically assisted cargo bikes to move freight around the city. Because my wife just asked me, you know, you've got to do something that makes you happy, and what makes you happy? And I said, I love riding my bicycle. And then we kind of put 2 and 2 together, and I started riding a bicycle for a really well-run company, ethically well managed. I was being paid the minimum wage, which is, you know, I wasn't being paid like an Uber courier for Uber delivery. I was getting a salary. I was riding a bike. I was getting out. I was getting exercise, and it just gave me time to exercise my body and my mind. And it was one of the best things I ever did, was to take that year off, if you like, from the kind of 9 to 5 full-time teaching and full-time working. And then in that year, because of the work I'd done before, I was invited by another university to join a design build project that they did every year in South Africa. And that happened the following year as well. So I was a kind of guest tutor, and they didn't pay me, but they paid for plane tickets and accommodation and a pickup truck rental for 2 weeks. And so I had this opportunity to go to a very, not remote, but a quite far away from the center of South Africa, to a community in the north of the country, not far from the border with Zimbabwe, where every year the University of Nottingham builds a early childhood development center, which is like a creche. And they work with a South African charity. And it's probably, very similar to American design build programs, where an architecture school goes and builds something in a community where there is a clear need for something. Mm-hmm. So the students learn, the community gets a building for free, and hopefully everyone has a great cultural experience. And before we started talking today, I've actually been writing an essay about this, because we're sort of 10 years into this project now, and COVID has sort of stopped everyone from traveling this year. And it is a really good moment to reflect on those 10 years, because I'm not just speaking for myself. I think people in that university that run this project will admit that the project has made mistakes in the past. And it's the second time I'm using this word today, but it is quite a colonial thing. It is 40 privileged, wealthy, mostly white British people flying to South Africa, building something for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 phases of 2 weeks, and then they fly home, and that's it. And that's not a really great relationship, because it doesn't really build capacity in the South African community that we go to. It kind of presents this building as if it's a gift from the privileged white folk in Europe, and then they leave, and they go home, and then they share loads of photographs on social media of, holding a South African child in their arms, going, "Oh, look, I built a preschool, aren't I amazing?" And there's a real problematic, because on the one hand, it's great where students are building things that make the lives of children better. Daycare centers which are without water, without electricity, and they are one-room shacks made of concrete blocks with a tin roof, and there's up to 60 children in a room with no facilities. And the students in England raise money, they agree a design, they go there, and they work really hard. They work 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day for 4 weeks, with a changeover in the middle for half the students. And they build a building. And on the one hand, I am deeply aware that the program is it has slightly racist problems that it needs to overcome. And it takes away, potentially, jobs from local people in South Africa, who would sometimes come to us and say, I can help you. Can I come and work for you? And the answer to that question is no, we can't pay anyone to work on this project. And that's a problem. We're not going to solve these bigger issues like that. So yes, in that time, because I didn't have a 9 to 5, I could ask my boss at the cycling courier company, can I have 2 weeks off? And it led me to go to South Africa. And I have some family connections to South Africa, but those connections were mainly everyone had either emigrated or left. And the last remaining relatives I have are not really people I have much in common with, shall we say. So I didn't really ever think I'd go there. And it was really eye-opening. And something that I may do again in the future, but I have to recognize that it's a huge privilege to be asked to go. It's not my right to just get on a plane and go there and have a great time working with students.
Well, it obviously had a good effect on you. I mean, you saw it differently than the students, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I actually, in the first year, my wife was able to come, and because she's not an architect, and because she wasn't representing the university or anyone, and also because, like I said, she's a grafter. She's an American, from a blue collar family in the Midwest. She's kind of works twice as hard as I do. She was able to talk to students with a real honesty about what they were doing and saying, "What do you think of this? Have you thought about this?" And she was able to do the same for me. And we took time out in the middle to just take a weekend away from the building site. And it's really vital to have that space to reflect on what you're doing. And Southern Africa is a highly it's often described in very patronizing terms as being developing nations with a lot of socioeconomic problems, but where we were working was a highly functioning society with a lot of inherent wealth and cultural richness. It's just not recognized as such by people in the global north. We tend to always put Africa and African nations in a box and sort of refer to them as if they need our help. And I think there's a future for us doing projects where we take European students to places like Southern Africa, and we do help and we do things, but we also have to make sure those students don't go back, as if they've just been on safari for 2 weeks, because that's not how that's not right.
Right. Very, very true. So you're teaching in Sweden. Are you teaching design studios or just lecture classes? What are you teaching right now?
Yeah, my first year I was teaching design, so I've been here a year this month, in fact. And when I arrived, I took on a studio of students in the second and third year, and the focus of the studio was suburbia. Basically, we were interested in understanding how, in Sweden particularly, the suburbs of cities are really confusing and messy, basically. Sweden, just very briefly, I think this is important to understand. In the history of Europe, Sweden was not involved in World War II. Sweden was neutral and did not participate in the war. They did permit Nazi German troops to pass through the country on their way to Norway. And that is a problematic sort of thing that was allowed to happen. But Sweden took the decision not to be involved in the war. And that meant in the 1940s, when the war ended, unlike Germany, unlike the UK, unlike France, Belgium, Sweden was not damaged. The industry and the economy was ready to respond to this massive post-war growth. And so Sweden became exceptionally wealthy in the second half of the 20th century. In the 19th century, Sweden was very, very poor, and a lot of people left Sweden to emigrate to America and Canada and Australia. And it was mostly a farming society. But what happened in the 20th century is that Sweden became incredibly wealthy. And in the 1960s, it did something quite incredible. The government was always sort of slightly to the political left. In the 1960s, they introduced a program called the Million Program, which intended to build 1 million new apartments and houses within 10 years. And they met their target, they exceeded it. And that was public housing. That wasn't private housing. They wanted to build 1 million public housing units in that time. And Sweden has maintained a political path which is very much to the left of the United States or the UK even. It is a socialist country. And as I've referred to earlier, it's a very high tax economy. It's a place which believes that every citizen must contribute a lot, But then the result of that contribution is that we have a very high standard of care for citizens. So I pay 35% of everything I earn in tax. And when I buy things in the shops, other than food, I pay 25% sales tax on everything. And petrol is expensive. The car taxes, insurance, it's not a cheap place to live. But men and women have equal rights to very long parental leave, up to a year when you have a child. There's comprehensive healthcare, comprehensive education, universities are free. So it's a kind of weird system to come into if you're not used to it. And in terms of architecture and our studio last year, I was amazed by the fact that the suburbs in Sweden around the city where we're working in Umeå, the suburbs are really beautiful. They're nice. They've got cycle paths, they've got play parks, they've got schools, and you can walk everywhere. You don't need a car. But then sort of on the edge of all this is a kind of classic American strip mall. American cars are really popular here because it's a wealthy country. People show their wealth by buying big Chevy pickup trucks. And so on the one hand, you have these suburbs where you can cycle your kids to school, and you can take a year's parental leave, and you see mums and dads equally in the park playing with their kids, and it's this kind of European socialist dream. And then on the edge of that is strip malls with pickup trucks and classic 1960s Pontiacs on a Saturday, revving their engines and doing burnouts. And it was a really interesting location to say to students, how do we square this off? How do we make sense of the fact that we have this problematic relationship to the car? We really don't need cars here. They're expensive and they're, polluting and not necessary, but we like them. So the students design projects for that kind of intersection of really well-planned suburbs and unplanned commercial space. And that went well, I think, but it wasn't really what I came here to do or wanted to do. So in negotiation with my management, I've actually moved this year, and I'm taking the summer off. But when I go back in August to prepare for the next semester, I'll be teaching history, and I'll be responsible for all the history of architecture teaching from the first year to the third year of the program. And that will all be online as well. So I don't have to teach studio, and I don't have to go to work. I can sit here and look out of my window at the forest and, do more lectures like this.
I really enjoyed our conversation. What would be your last thoughts to the audience?
Okay, and I'm gonna speak, I hope, to the freshmen and freshmen and women, the first year students, and people who are setting out on this journey. Is I recognize that you are under a lot of pressure every single day. Like, this is a big deal, what you've chosen to do, and I cannot imagine. Some of you are doing this while you're raising kids, or you're working long hours, and there may be a little voice in your head that says you're not sure what you should be doing or whether you've made the right choice. And some of you have not made the right choice. Okay, let's just recognize that you're going to realize that you're not on the right path. But the story I've kind of told in this conversation, and I think this is maybe how we started talking at this conference, is I'm now 37, so I've been alive as long as I will have to work to get to retirement age, basically. Certainly in the UK, I might retire a bit earlier in Sweden, but that's a kind of, I hope, reassuring, is that you can make wrong turns and they lead you to really interesting places. I set out wanting to be an architect, and it turned out not to be. I didn't get there. I ended up being a teacher, and I never really thought I'd be a teacher. And now I have the chance to, as I will be, I have the chance to rewrite an entire curriculum for the history of architecture. So I was looking at the reading list today, and I have to tell you, they're all white European men who wrote those books, and that's not how the architecture of the world has been written. So I have an opportunity to change not just a class or a lesson, but to think about how we teach architecture in a whole course. And I'm really saddened that because of COVID, I can't travel at all and I can't go abroad. But suddenly I was thinking like, well, there are some really great lecturers who use an iPhone and a GoPro, and who don't do their lectures like this, sitting at a computer. They go out, for a walk, or they go and show you examples of the buildings they're talking about. So I'm hoping that out of this strange situation where I'm living in a farmhouse in the forest in the north of Sweden, there might even be an opportunity to do something, completely different.
Oh.
And if I can do it, who knows the stories that your students will tell in 20 or 30 years' time.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, James. This has been wonderful. I appreciate your time to speak with us and do this interview. And I wish you the best.
Thank you. Thanks, Emmanuel. And I hope that I get to travel to the States again soon. I mean, I'd love to see you again at the NCBDS, the conference we're at. And I still haven't been to El Paso. I've ticked off a lot of states, but I've still got to make it down to your corner of the country. So I hope to meet you and your students someday soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
This concludes our program. Thank you for listening to Art Talks Presents, brought to you by EPCC's Architecture Society, an interview with James Benedict Brown. And James, we hope to see you in El Paso soon as well. This is your host, Emmanuel Moreno. Until next time.